Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This will be covering episode 4, parts 10 and 11 of my Let's Play. They will have spoilers for the entirety of the game, so don't watch if you haven't played the whole thing. Some of the things I mention will not make sense to you otherwise. Content warning in part of this video for discussion of suicidal ideation. There will be a mark in the timestamp for the section where that discussion happens, but it's going to be pretty much immediate because it's the first topic, the rest of which will not really touch on it. And we start this section with Ange on the boat talking to Amakusa, where he's trying to ask what her overall plan is, what her long-term plan is. What's she going to do after the immediate journey is over, after she's done going to talk to all these people about what happened 12 years ago. And Ange dances around it, and we'll see this in future sections too, but we can effectively say here, she's not planning on anything. She doesn't have any intention of doing anything after that point. Her entire drive, her entire motivation is a wish to be reunited with her family in a way that's not really physically possible, and in a way that she isn't able to emotionally do either unless she has some sort of revelation about magic, so we'll see how that goes later in the episode. But in terms of practical, real-world situation, what objective things is she going to do, which is what Amakusa is asking about. She has no ambitions. She's not interested in the Ashuramiya group. She's not interested in finding something else to do with her life. We know eventually she's going to become an author. She is going to find something to do with her life that breaks the abusive cycle, because we can talk about it more when we get there and get more of the context, but from my recollection of it, she's basically trying to do something to help kids in a similar situation to her. She's trying to offer a way out of being the lonely witch, the one who serves as the lightning rod for abuse from everyone else. But at this time she exists only to carry out her very short-term objective. An objective she knows is futile and is basically trying to grapple with it one last time. And this, in some ways, is already borrowed time for her. She thinks back to her meeting with Bernkastel on top of the building, and I said before that Ange's story splits there, where one version involves her becoming a piece on the witch's game board directly, and one version involves her going off and investigating what happened on Rokkenjima. But in one sense, you could take that as quite simply her life is over. She was ready to step right off, but Bernkastel stepped in and said, maybe there's one more thing you could do. And she's willing to do this final investigation, even though in many of these scenes she mostly seems to be clarifying and confirming stuff she already knows and suspects. And not in the sense of Ange before has had a lot of suppositions, say, about Ava and Ava's motivations. But in these situations, it's more the case that Ange has put two and two together and is just confirming that the result is correct. She already pretty much knows every time she pulls out the grimoire that she's looking at actual Beatrice's handwriting, and she just needs to do the extra step while she's there and say, yes. So there is in fact still this distinct person. And she gets some advice, philosophizing, just thinking out loud from Amakusa, who effectively tells her that all that matters is her own satisfaction, and not even necessarily in the satisfaction of specific objectives as much as being satisfied. The act of being happy and being content can be an end in and itself, and can be a worthy motivating factor, can be a worthy goal. And once again, I have to think, in this situation, is Amakusa mostly here to protect Ange in the long term as well as the short term? He's obviously loaded up with guns and has all of his combat training, but is he also supposed to be positioned here to try and gently nudge Ange towards being willing to accept her role as running the Ashuramiya group? Because that is effectively what Okage wants, and Okage is the one who hired Amakusa, and Amakusa has these weird moments of just stepping forward and saying some philosophizing or some sort of motivating or helpful little spiel that does seem to work for Ange. Ange seems to take it to heart. Similar to Okage telling her without love it cannot be seen, he's telling her things that Ange would probably benefit from hearing and listening to and internalizing, but they might be being said because of business interests that benefit from this 18-year-old being not just stable and happy and content, but also possibly quite indebted emotionally to the one who wants to continue his position of power. Again, it doesn't mean the advice is wrong, it just means that it's maybe not coming from a purely altruistic point of view. After this, Ange reflects on Maria Sakutaro, how she behaved on, she says, that day, which is interesting in that it's a parallel situation. She is both thinking of the day when she, in her mind, killed all of the stakes of purgatory because the bullying had gotten to a particular climax and she knew that her imaginary friends could not give her any real world help or objective help. But she's also talking about the time when she and the real world Maria had their big fight. And that's an interesting parallel to Battler and Shannon, because this is another case where Ange didn't really know what she was saying and the emotional impact it was having on a very fragile Maria. It is something Ange said in a more privileged life where she had a happy home life with loving parents, as far as we're aware. We'll learn more about her parents later. And Maria was in a very vulnerable state, had a significant dependence on certain coping mechanisms, and cared enough about Ange to try to share those coping mechanisms with her, only for Ange to, not maliciously and not in any way with real intent, to tear apart Maria's coping mechanisms. Because a lot of this too is not even Ange having any real will as what? She was 6 at the time of the disaster, so she was at most 6 when she had this fight with Maria. She might have been younger. Anything she's doing at that age, she's more than anything trying to exemplify the examples being set for her. She's trying to align herself with the rational kind of thinking that Kyrie and her father display. She's just trying to say, adults said this thing, so I'm doing this thing. If you're doing the other thing, if you're doing silly witch stuff, that's nonsense. None of it's real. And Maria's devastated by this for very understandable reasons. Ange just doesn't even really get it. Ange doesn't understand Maria's investment, she doesn't understand Maria's motivations or needs, and Ange forgets about this fight, because it was nothing to her. This was not a clash of ideals, this was, I just parroted what my parents say, and it was devastating to the child who is trying to hold herself together when she has an abusive parent. But Ange realizes in this moment that she still did that, and it was still wrong. It's not that her as a child with questionable amounts of agency means that it's meaningless. It means that she's sympathetic. In the same way that you can look at Rosa as an abusive mother, you can condemn her abuse, you can understand her status as a victim, and those two truths simultaneously exist. And in the same way, you can say why Ange was not being malicious as a child for doing this horrible thing, but that there is still something to apologize for. There is still something she did to Maria that affected Maria and Maria's ability to keep going. It was a moment where Maria had a possibility of getting more support from another person, and it was denied. Again, it was denying Maria. And Ange didn't see it that way at the time, and Ange didn't even really think through that in her school years, even as she was reconciling with Maria, reading Maria's diary. It took until she was 18 for Ange to understand something she had done at least 12 years earlier. And that's a very human experience too. A lot of people think back on their memories and don't really realize what they had done at the time, because life experience really changes how you're able to unpack a situation, and children don't have a lot of life experience to be unpacking things. And importantly, when you talk about the idea that Ange was young, so was Maria, you can't view it as a binary of like who is at fault or is no one at fault. It's more important to think about the situation and like the harm and the actual emotions involved, because it's not a trolley problem. Things are not reducible to a philosophical right or wrong answer. Things are a lot messier and complex, and at the end of the day, you need to unpack that stuff to be able to reconcile with those people, even if it may be a posthumous reconciliation. Ange is more willing to apologize to Maria in this moment and able to try and bring her back and bring some more joy to Maria, to try and stitch closed a wound from many years before. And as a parallel to Battler and Beatrice, it really even further criticizes Battler because he was older. He should have known what he was doing more. There's a lot more against Battler in that situation, and yet he is not wholly condemnable because he was still a stupid child. And this closes out with a section where Ange is able to revive Sakataro. She summons all of the Sisters of Purgatory, and they kind of go, this is not like a conflict of interest or something, because aren't you trying to undermine Beatrice? And Ange has a revelation where she is willing to accept magic without strictly practicing it. She talks around the wording of this quite a bit, but kind of comes to the moment of being able to acknowledge Maria's magic, even if she herself doesn't believe. And it's ultimately because Ange has learned to value respecting and acknowledging other people, even when it doesn't fully make sense to you. Put more simply, she doesn't quite understand still Maria's happy life, but she is no longer going to insist that there was not one. She has come to realize she should respect and acknowledge Maria's version of events. Because again, it's all posthumous. There is one version of things where she is maybe pushing to get Maria moved to a better situation, but in the world where this is all done and there's nothing to be fixed, it is better that Ange just accepts Maria's story and doesn't try to undermine Maria's story, and that to do so would honestly be cruel. And so even if Maria still doesn't have that kind of magic that Maria does, she doesn't need to resist Maria's magic. The anti-magic toxin can disappear from Ange because she is no longer suppressing that magic, even if she herself is not much of a witch. And then we skip forward to the Assure Me a Family conference, which is of course going to be led by the head Kinzo, as he finally appears to people. Before he even truly appears, I like the little nod of everyone is aware of Kinzo's presence based on footsteps and knocking on the door. Kinzo's personhood is even evident based on the behavior he exhibits when not visible. The siblings that are scheming against Kraus in this section, they talk about the fact that once they see Father, it is clear that the jig is up. But until they actually see him, Everything else could be facsimile. And it's interesting how much visuals are treated as a confirmation. Visuals are not fakeable. Once you see the man, it is clearly that man. Whereas sight, sound, impressions, indirect things like that, those might be faked or only fabricated, applied, or just manipulated, per se. But seeing him in the flesh bestows such complete proof that they couldn't even fight it at that point. Now, I don't know for sure entirely how much lying is happening with this section. The magical narrative here clearly strays far from the truth. As always, having Canon and Shannon in the same room at the same time is a big tell for magical situations. But there is going to be red truths later that will nail down on the idea of the head appearing. And I believe Battler himself gets around those truths a little bit by talking about the fact that though no one would mistake someone else for Kinzo, they would acknowledge a person as the head, and that person is who walked in, not specifically Ashuramiya Kinzo. And so this might be a moment where Beatrice walks in and says who she is and reveals herself directly as the new head. But it honestly might be a little bit more wonky than that. I'm kind of curious to see how it goes. I do know this is the one where I feel like massive amounts of it are withheld in an interesting way. And we're only even going to get the death portrait updates right at the end. I think it's even in the tea party they all happen. So a lot of facts and red text for sure is going to be very late appearing. So I'm honestly not even going to be speculating too much on these things to begin with. But I think in terms of proof and senses being taken as real, it's fun that they hear light footsteps and they're like, well, that's not grandfather. And they hear someone knock on the door and like, okay, well, that's not him then. When he is in the room himself, Goldsmith uses this moment to berate every one of his children for being failures and incompetent, and while he is correct, he is purely judging them on their ability to accumulate wealth, because that is something he did quite well. Because he had a massive store of gold to use as leverage and clout, he was given a... As much as Kinzo did get a shitty position by being made to be head of a family he had no interest in, he was also given masses of privilege to rebuild that family with. And so his yardstick of what he's measuring his children against is quite unfair. Even if I think they somewhat deserve to be taken down a peg, I don't think Kinzo's the one who should be throwing those stones. But in particular, Nanjo turns the conversation where Nanjo starts to talk about things that cannot be bought with money. And I enjoy this because very early in this section, Shannon also briefly mentions that the things she wants can't be bought with money. And when Shannon says it, it's a very romantic notion. It's about the idea of things that are more valuable than material goods. Ethereal, abstract love and how beautiful that is, while at the same time in Shannon's case it's referring to the impossibility of things she would like to do, but even massive bribes would not get her the life she wants. And when Nanjo brings it up, he is trying to insinuate that the success, the literal number of cash that Kinzo's children have accumulated, are meaningless when in comparison to the children the grandchildren that Kinzo has acquired over the years. To which Kinzo says, I don't particularly like any of them either. And again, you think about the fact that there are things money cannot buy. and sometimes it's because those things are worthless. To Kinzo, at least this Kinzo, he does not care about his grandchildren. They are all disappointments too. George could be described as a successful go-getter, but Kinzo values very particular things, and Kinzo wants a shitty cutthroat businessman. Kraus is too soft for him. I feel like some amalgamation of Ava, Kraus, and Rudolph is probably the ideal of a child that Kinzo wanted, but would definitely have to be a man, and would have to contain all of their best qualities and none of their worst. And George has some good qualities, but he is not a shark. He is not the shark Kinzo wants, and he's certainly not the brash and forceful kind of shark that Kinzo wants. As much as George likes to talk about building up his castle, it certainly feels like he's laying bricks and not conquering countries to do it. I do like Kinzo's shitty example of, I have created life with 10 billion yen. What an interesting alchemical example. What an insufferable man. Even without the abuse, he's also just awful. Especially to then start to needle all of the children and ask whether their children are worth 10 billion yen, knowing full well that he's effectively trying to get them to justify their contributions for his sake. None of them are actually asking about what their children are worth or what value they have to them personally and emotionally. Instead, he's saying, this is another game. I'm going to play with you. Play with me. I am going to play with you, and you have to play along if you want to get access to my money. Which is why you get all of the kids very strategically answering. Even though all of these parents do love their children. All of them would genuinely tell you, yes, I care about my child. Rudolph and Kyrie would maybe kill their children for money. We'll get to dig into that proper later, but they're certainly not the most loving of the people here, but barring them, I genuinely believe everyone else would choose their child over money. The only other question mark is maybe Kraus, but I don't think that's actually real. I don't think he would be willing to do it. And the thing I enjoy is that no one's explanation of their children particularly rings true for Kinzo, but he does basically muse to himself afterwards. Dreams in the future, miracles and possibilities are the source of my magical power. And so he is effectively thinking, I guess the grandchildren could become something valuable to me, even if they are not currently. Which is dark to think about if you expect him to try and mold, say, Maria in his own image. None of these kids should turn out like Kinzo. I would pray that all of them turn out better than him. One minor thing from here, and we will have a little bit more to talk about this in a future video, is where Runaway and Virgilia on the game board begin to discuss the meta board construct. Virgilia and Runaway start talking about Battler playing his game against Beatrice, because Virgilia comments on how far the magical narrative is straying from the undergirding objective reality, and she says, I hope he does not surrender, clearly talking about Battler, to which Runaway says he learned a lot last time. The important part being the ways in which the meta stuff is bleeding over into the real game board. This is something I found very confusing my first time through, because I couldn't quite grasp how the distinct layers did or did not influence each other. And remember a fun note I made at the end of episode 3 where Battler literally grabs Avatrice from the game board and pulls her to the meta level. He pulls through the fourth wall in one sense, but in one way he's pulling her out of the fiction. She is not addressing outside of the fiction, he is dragging her out of the fiction to address her. But this too, especially as the fourth game, and I will need to read some later stuff to get a better handle on how these successive tales exist in universe real world, but this does function as a development where what started as a mystery / fantasy story with a push and pull there has become more self-referential at this point. These characters are talking about the work. These characters in the story are talking about the story. And they're obviously doing it in an abstracted way because they're talking about the game board, but the game board is itself people reading and untangling a story, or a person untangling a story with the author there to respond. And I find that fun, and this is episode 4, and we're gonna keep ramping up the levels of this stuff interacting with each other. And actually, to tag onto that, Kinzo saying, "It is still too soon for the coming of the second twilight, is what the source of my magical power is whispering to me." The source of his magical power is the author. The one spinning the magical narrative tale. Beatrice is telling him, pacing-wise, no, you can't kill that many people. You can't kill 8 people this soon. It's way too soon. Which is a little bit of an extra funny goof because of how the murders in this will be very unevenly distributed anyway, especially with the pacing of this episode being what it is. It has taken quite a while to get to the first Twilight compared to... I would have to check compared to episode 1. Episode 1 probably took longer, but I'm fairly sure that episodes 2 and 3 were much quicker than this one. Even though episode 3 still did set up for backstory stuff, I think for the most part they kind of get to the first Twilight to establish the tension. Whereas in this one, a lot of tension came from those backstories. But that is going to do it for this video. Next time, we will be covering a section with Rosa that I had forgotten even happened until some comments on the last video kept alluding to it, and I realized there was some juicy closure that we will be addressing soon, and that will really be pushing the boundaries of people act within character when on screen. But we'll get there. Until then, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.